What if I told you that the fairy tales you grew up with, the ones filled with enchanted forests, singing animals, and magical rescues, were never meant for children at all? Behind every once upon a time was a nightmare that someone actually lived through a real event so terrible that communities had to disguise it in story form just to cope. And what if I also told you that the monsters in those stories were often flesh and blood, walking the same streets as their victims? We're about to tear away the Disney gloss and step into the darkness beneath. If you dare to keep going, hit subscribe now, because the truths you're about to hear will haunt you long after the story ends. It begins in the flickering half-light of medieval Europe, a place where wolves howled beyond the gates at night, where famine could strip a village to bones, and where superstition and fact tangled like the roots of an ancient forest. The brothers Grimm didn't invent their tales. They were curators of dread, collectors of whispers passed down through generations, whispers born from blood, grief, and survival. These were not bedtime stories. They were warnings, and they were all too real. Take Hameln, Germany, in the year 1284. The town was prosperous, its church bells a familiar comfort over the marketplace chatter. On a warm summer evening, as families prepared their suppers, they noticed something strange, a quiet too deep, an absence too sharp. The laughter of children had stopped. Every boy and girl between the ages of 4 and 14 was gone. Not misplaced, gone. 130 children vanished that day, led away by a man in clothing so bright he looked like he had stepped out of a festival or a fever dream. He played a strange lilting tune, and the children followed as if under a spell. This wasn't a fable about rats and pest control. That detail was added centuries later to make the story safer for young ears. The original accounts tell only of the man, the music, and the long walk from which no one returned. The chroniclers recorded the date with an exactness almost unheard of in medieval times, June 26, 1284. That alone should chill you. In an age when even a king's birth year might be vaguely remembered, the townsfolk carved that date into stained glass and inked it into ledgers. It was the day their world ended. What happened to those children? Theories are grim. Some say they were taken east to populate dangerous frontier lands. Others believe they were part of a failed religious crusade, perishing along the way. The most sinister theory whispers of a mass drowning in the nearby river, perhaps as part of a ritual gone wrong. Whatever the truth, Hameln never recovered. Many families left. Those who stayed banned music from the street. The children last walked a band that lingers in local legend even now. Centuries later, and hundreds of miles away, another predator was perfecting his craft. This one wasn't a man in bright clothes, but something far more bestial. Between 1764 and 1767, in the forests of south-central France, people began to vanish or were found in pieces. The locals called it La Bête du Gévaudan, the beast of Gévaudan, and they meant it literally. Eyewitnesses described a wolf-like creature the size of a calf with a broad chest and jaws so strong they could sever a human head in one bite. It wasn't just its size that terrified them, it was its mind. It stalked, deliberately choosing victims, often lone women and children, and striking with precision. Sometimes it seemed to toy with them, letting them glimpse it before closing in. The beast's hunting grounds included the narrow woodland paths young girls used to carry food to sick relatives. Again and again, survivors told of baskets tumbling from small hands of snarls in the underbrush of teeth flashing in the gloom. If you think that sounds familiar, it should. These were the real-world shadows of Little Red Riding Hood. Only in the original versions there was no woodcutter to save the girl. Often there was no body to bury. One such girl, 19-year-old Marie-Jeanne Vallée, faced the beast with a spear when it lunged at her. She lived to tell her story, and her testimony reads like the blueprint for the fairy tale we know today, minus the happy ending. In Charles Perrault's 1697, telling the wolf tricks the girl into eating her grandmother's flesh before swallowing her whole. Brutal, yes. But in the real forests of France, the lesson was just as brutal travel alone, and you might never come back. Long before wolves stalked French forests, another horror swept across Europe, one with no teeth or claws yet far deadlier. Between 1315 and 1322, the skies betrayed the land. Crops failed year after year, rains rotted the fields, and winter refused to let go. This was the Great Famine, and it turned villages into graveyards. In such times, cruelty was not born of malice but of arithmetic. Food prices soared by more than 800%. Livestock starved. Families huddled around dying fires, staring at their dwindling stores of grain, and knowing they would not last until spring. Choices had to be made, and the smallest, weakest mouths were the ones marked for sacrifice. Abandoning children to the forest was no whispered rumor. It was documented fact. Court records from famine years show hundreds of such cases. Parents would tell their children they were going berry picking or visiting distant kin. They'd walk them deep into the woods, far enough that no landmark could guide them home, then leave them with a scrap of bread and the echo of their footsteps fading away. And when starvation hollowed out morality, the forest became a hunting ground, not just for animals but for people. Chronicles speak of strangers offering food to wandering children, luring them into cottages where the warmth was a trap. Some of those cottages earned a grim nickname in German Hexenhäuser or witch houses. They were not the homes of magical crones, but of desperate men and women who had crossed into cannibalism. The gingerbread house in the story of Hansel and Gretel. That was no flight of whimsy. It was a coded warning to children: beware of gifts from strangers in times of hunger. Bread could be bait, sugar could hide a snare. And inside, the oven wasn't for baking treats, it was for making sure no one found a body. Archaeological digs in remote forests have uncovered shallow graves holding the bones of children from this very period. Many of these burials date to the famine years, and some skeletons bear cut marks consistent with butchery. The fairy tale, it seems, was not an exaggeration. If anything, it was a softened version of the truth. In the Grimm brothers' recording, Hansel drops breadcrumbs to mark the path home. This detail had roots in real survival training. Medieval parents, when they weren't abandoning their children, sometimes taught them to mark paths with stones, twigs, or crumbs in case they became lost while foraging. It was a grim acknowledgement of how easy it was for a child to disappear into the green-black maze of the woods. But famine did more than fill graves. It hardened hearts. In the oldest versions of Hansel and Gretel, there is no tearful debate between mother and father, no reluctant surrender to necessity. The father simply agrees to the plan. The stepmother insists it must be done. In famine years, sentimentality could kill the survivors as surely as starvation. The trauma of those years lingered for centuries, woven into oral traditions and bedtime warnings. To a child in the 18th century, the story was not a distant myth, but a memory passed down. When food runs out, beware. Even those who love you may leave you to die. And just as starvation could twist the bond between parent and child, envy and greed could poison the ties of blood. Which brings us to another fairy tale born not from magic, but from a slow, deliberate murder in the cold halls of a noble house. The tale the world calls Snow White. It is the year 1533 in the German region of Waldeck. Behind the stone walls of a noble estate, a young woman named Margarete von Waldeck moves with the grace expected of someone of her rank. She is 16, beautiful, and an heir to a fortune built on mines that dig deep into the earth. But those mines hold a darker truth, one that will entwine with her own fate. The Waldeck family's mining empire relied on children, not apprentices or wards, laborers, some as young as 7, their growth stunted by malnutrition, their backs bent from years underground. Locals called them the little people. In the tunnels, dust filled their lungs, and the damp cold gnawed at their bones. Many never reached adulthood. Margaretha, unlike her father and stepmother, began to question the morality of this system. Servants whispered that she spoke of reforms of easing the conditions in the mines, even at the cost of profit. To a girl raised in privilege, it was an act of compassion. To those whose fortunes depended on exploitation, it was a dangerous rebellion. Her stepmother, Katharina von Hatzfeld, had married into the family for status and wealth. With Margaretha's death, her own children would inherit everything. The solution, whispered in corridors and hinted at in glances, was as cold as the silver pulled from the mines remove the girl. The poison came slowly. A pinch in her drink, a powder in her food. Enough to weaken, to pale the skin, to make her retreat to her chambers and sleep for long stretches. The effect was almost theatrical, as if she were under an enchantment. Servants noted she seemed to drift between life and death, her beauty intact, but her strength fading. After weeks of decline, Margaretha died. The official cause was left vague, but the court physician's notes, carefully stored in the family archive, spoke plainly. Arsenic, mercury, and other heavy metals were found in her system. The dose had been repeated over many weeks, the work of someone patient, deliberate, and intimate with the victim's routine. 3 centuries later, scientific analysis of preserved strands of her hair confirmed those notes. The toxins were there, layered like the rings of a tree, each marking another step toward the grave. The fairy tale's motif of a poisoned apple. In Waldeck, the fruit was simply the delivery system for something far deadlier. As for the magic mirror, that too had roots in truth. Katharina was famously vain, commissioning expensive Venetian mirrors for her chambers, a luxury so costly it rivaled the annual income of lesser noble houses. The stepmother's obsession with beauty wasn't a metaphor. It was part of her identity, flaunted as much as her jewels. In the days after Margaretha's death, her body was displayed in an open coffin, as was custom. Visitors remarked on her appearance she seemed merely asleep, untouched by decay. The poisons used on her had an unintended side effect. They preserved her beauty even in death. It was a tableau chillingly close to the fairy tale's glass coffin. In the Grimm brothers' version, the jealous queen is punished. In Waldeck, there was no justice. Katharina inherited the wealth she desired. The mines continued to run on child labor, and the story, stripped of its names and made palatable for the hearth, lived on as Snow White. But the lesson for those who remembered was clear. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one sitting across the table at supper. Long before Disney softened her into a vision of innocence, awoken by a kiss, Sleeping Beauty's first incarnation was a story soaked in violation and betrayal. The earliest version, Sun, Moon, and Talia, appeared in 1634 in a collection by Italian poet Giambattista Basile. There was no romantic awakening, no heroic prince, only an unconscious girl and a man who saw her vulnerability as an invitation. In Basile's telling, Talia pricks her finger on a splinter of flax and falls into an unshakable sleep. Months pass. A king hunting in the forest discovers her lifeless form in an abandoned estate. He does not attempt to wake her. Instead, he assaults her, returning again and again while she remains unresponsive. 9 months later, still asleep, Talia gives birth to twins. Only when one of the babies sucks the splinter from her finger does she stir and open her eyes, awakening into a nightmare of confusion and shame. The father of her children is not a savior, but a predator, a married man who now has 2 illegitimate heirs. This was no invention for shock value. Records from medieval Europe reveal a disturbing pattern. Women in comas or catatonic states were vulnerable to assault from those entrusted with their care, sometimes even family or clergy. In a French convent in the 16th century, one such case became a scandal when the victim awoke pregnant, her attackers exposed as the very priests who had been praying over her. The so-called spinning wheel curse in later versions may have its roots in ergot, poisoning a mold that grew on rye in damp years. Consumed in bread, it could trigger convulsions, hallucinations, and comas lasting days or weeks. In an age without medical understanding, such episodes were seen as curses or acts of the devil. In Basile's version, the king's wife soon learns of the twins. Her reaction is one of calculated vengeance. She orders her cook to kill the children, roast them, and serve them to her husband. The cook spares them substituting lamb, but the intent is clear: to erase the living evidence of her husband's betrayal. Cannibalistic revenge plots were not uncommon in medieval storytelling. They mirrored real acts in which noble rivals poisoned or murdered illegitimate heirs to protect their own bloodlines. Infanticide was often hidden behind tales of sudden sickness or divine judgment. When Charles Perrault adapted the story in 1697, he removed the assault and the cannibalism, replacing them with a chivalrous kiss and a blissful marriage. The Grimm brothers later polished it further. What had once been a stark warning about vulnerability and exploitation became a fantasy of rescue and romance. The truth behind Sleeping Beauty was never meant to comfort. It told medieval audiences that beauty could be a curse, that unconsciousness could be as dangerous as open rebellion, and that the predators you feared might not lurk in the woods but in your own home. In the softened version, the princess lives happily ever after. In the real world, women like Talia lived with the scars of crimes committed while they could not speak, fight, or even open their eyes, and the system more often than not looked away. In 1440, French authorities arrested one of the wealthiest and most celebrated men in Europe, a war hero, a companion of Joan of Arc, and a nobleman with enough gold to fund his own armies. His name was Gilles de Rais, and the charges against him were so horrific that even a medieval court accustomed to brutality could scarcely process them. For over a decade, children had been disappearing from villages around his estates. The victims were not from noble families. They were the sons and daughters of peasants sent to his castles to work as pages' servants or choir boys. Once inside the high stone walls, they vanished. Parents were told their children had been sent to another estate or had run away. The truth was far darker. When one of de Rais's accomplices was caught attempting to rob a church, torture loosened his tongue. He confessed to helping his master lure abuse and kill dozens, perhaps hundreds of children. The details he provided were so explicit that court scribes omitted the worst of them from the official record. Witnesses spoke of locked chambers deep within the castle, where de Rais kept instruments of torture. He would invite children into these rooms with promises of fine clothes or food, lock the door, and begin a ritual of cruelty that could last for hours. Their bodies were burned in large fireplaces, their ashes scattered in the gardens. It was in this reality that the bones of the Bluebeard tale took shape. In the folk version, a wealthy man gives his young wife keys to his entire house, save for one room she must never open. Curiosity drives her to unlock it, revealing the bodies of his previous wives. The real story was far worse. The forbidden room was not filled with dead women, but the remains of murdered children. De Rais's crimes were protected for years by his wealth and political connections. Local officials ignored complaints, unwilling to challenge a man who had fought for France's salvation in the 100 Years' War. Some even sent him their own children as a sign of loyalty, never to see them again. When the investigation finally came, it was swift and damning. Testimonies from hundreds of witnesses painted a portrait of a man who believed that the more innocent the victim, the greater the supernatural power he could gain from their death. His murders were not crimes of impulse, but calculated rituals. At his trial, de Rais showed flashes of arrogance and charm, as though he believed he might yet talk his way out of execution. But when the sentence was read, death by hanging and burning, he reportedly broke down asking forgiveness from God and from the families of his victims. On the day of his execution, a crowd of thousands gathered. Some came seeking closure. Others came to see if a man so monstrous could truly die like any other. When the flames rose, they say the wind carried the smell far beyond the city walls. For many, it was the only proof they would ever have that justice had been done. The fairy tale that survived stripped away the children, the torture, the decade of impunity. It became a cautionary fable about female curiosity and marital obedience. But in its bones remained the echo of the truth that wealth and charm can hide rot, and that the most beautiful castle can be built over a graveyard. By now, a pattern should be clear. These fairy tales were never whimsical diversions. They were repositories of collective trauma. Entire communities encoded their worst fears and most painful experiences into stories, softening the edges so the next generation could bear to hear them and learn from them. The Pied Piper wasn't about pest control. It was about the mass disappearance of a town's children. Little Red Riding Hood was not a lesson in politeness, but a survival warning about predators on lonely roads. Hansel and Gretel wasn't an imaginative parable. It was famine abandonment and the unthinkable turning of parents against their own. Snow White's poisoned apple wasn't a whimsical plot device. It was an echo of slow, deliberate murder in the gilded halls of nobility, with wealth as the motive and vanity as the mask. Sleeping Beauty wasn't kissed awake by love. She was awoken into the aftermath of assault her fate decided while she could not fight back. And Bluebeard. That was the desperate warning that behind charm and splendor can lurk a butcher, protected by power, until the bodies pile too high to hide. Strip away the enchantment, and you're left with something raw, ugly, and far more frightening than magic human cruelty without consequence. These tales traveled far because they were useful. In an age without police forces, as we know them, without forensic science, without international news stories, were the safety net. They carried instructions. Beware of the stranger, don't wander off the path, never take food from unknown hands, and be suspicious of the wealthy who keep secrets. But with time, the original terror became inconvenient. The Enlightenment, the rise of printing and the growth of a literate middle class, transformed oral cautionary tales into published children's books. The violence was scrubbed away, replaced with morals fit for the nursery. The wolf became a naughty trickster. The witch's oven became a plot twist. Disney and other 20th century adapters went further, sanding down every splinter of dread until the stories became glossy entertainment. The happy endings we know today are not the real endings they're marketing. In the process, we forgot that the fear once served a purpose, yet the bones of the old warnings remain if you know where to look. The eerie specificity of a date carved into Hameln's church window. The repeated reports of a beast that preferred little girls carrying food. The matter-of-fact acceptance of child abandonment during famine years. The toxic metals in the hair of a murdered noblewoman. The convent records of women waking to find themselves pregnant. Each of these details, preserved in some archive or artifact, is a thread connecting the fairy tale to its real-world origin. Pull on that thread, and the beautiful tapestry unravels, revealing a history far more disturbing than the fiction it inspired. And when you see the tales for what they are, you start to notice something else. The same patterns still play out today. Disappearances ignored because the victims are poor. Predators protected by status. Crimes softened in public retelling until they become palatable and forgettable. The monsters change their names, but they never really leave the story. Think of the Pied Piper's bright clothes and hypnotic tune. Now replace him with a smiling official promising opportunity, or a recruiter offering escape from poverty. The melody changes, but the path still leads away from home, and too often no one follows to see where it ends. Consider the beast of Gévaudan a predator who studied his prey before striking. Today, the wolf wears a different skin, perhaps a digital avatar, a trusted community figure, or a familiar face on a screen. The forest is no longer made of trees, but of networks and alleyways where help cannot hear you scream. Hansel and Gretel's famine was a slow violence eroding the will to protect. Modern famine can take the form of economic collapse, forced migration, or policy decisions that leave the weakest stranded. The forest is still there. The breadcrumbs still vanish. Snow White's poison lingers too, not just in arsenic and mercury, but in the quiet elimination of rivals, the weaponizing of image and reputation to make someone disappear without a trace of blood. The mirror is now a feed of filtered photographs and carefully managed public perception. Sleeping Beauty's helplessness speaks across centuries. Vulnerability is still exploited sometimes by those tasked with safeguarding it. The violence may not leave bruises, but it leaves scars in memory and trust, shaping how survivors see the world long after they wake. Bluebeard's locked room is not always a chamber with a key. It can be a sealed file, a private server, a room where only the powerful enter. And what is hidden inside is still often the same, the evidence of harm done to those who were never meant to be found. When the brothers Grimm collected their tales, they believed they were preserving a cultural heritage. And they were, but it was a heritage of fear, survival, and the coded language of warning. They may have dulled the blades, but the shapes of the weapons remain. To read these stories as harmless fantasy is to miss their most urgent message that danger often comes wearing a familiar face, that survival sometimes depends on breaking the rules, and that forgetting the past makes us easier prey. The castles, the forests, the spinning wheels, they are set dressing for truths that still matter. They tell us that power without limits corrupts, that hunger can turn love to betrayal, that beauty can be as dangerous as it is coveted, and that silence allows the worst evils to thrive. So, the next time you hear, "Once upon a time," remember what those words really mean. Pay attention. They are the opening to a map drawn in shadow, and blood passed from the dead to the living. And if you listen closely, you might hear the warning that saved someone's life centuries ago, a warning that could still save yours today.